Okay, everybody, we're on DAF Yud Ches Samad Aleph at the Mishnah, and we continue with the protocol when the Kohen is being sequestered for those 7 days. Masru lo Zekenim Miziknei Beistin. So he is assigned with elders from the Beistin, the Koren Lefanav B'Seder Hayom, and they recite for him the various psukim and halachas that have to do with the order of the day. Va'omrim lo, and they say to him, Ishi, Kohen Gadol. They say, Sir, Kohen Gadol, Kura ata beficha. You need to recite these verses yourself. Shema shachachta, because you may have forgotten, or Shema lo lamadata, or maybe you never learned them in the first place. Erev Yom Kippurim Shacharis. Now, we get to Erev Yom Kippur in the morning. Mamidin oso b'shar Mizrach. We bring the Kohen Gadol to the eastern gate. Umavirin lefanav parim ve'ilam uchivasim kadei sheyeh makir v'ragel ba'avoda. We pass before him bulls, rams, and sheep, and we say to him, "Look, remember that bull? Remember what you're going to do with that bull? Okay, and like he chazers over. Remember to see the sheep. Remember what you're going to do with the sheeps, and so a sheep and so forth. Okay." Kol shivas hayamim lo hayumonin mimenu ma'achal umishta. Furthermore, for the full 7 days of sequestration, we did not withhold from him anything he wanted to eat and drink was great. But Erev Yom Kippur mim chashecha lo hayu manichanos olechol harbe mipnei shehamachal mevi esashena. However, on Erev Yom Kippur towards the afternoon, we told him you have to eat very lightly because eating a heavy meal will cause you to fall asleep. And one of the reasons why we don't want the Kohen Gadol to fall asleep, or at least the main reason, is that he should not have carry, he should not have a seminal emission inadvertently. Okay, let's take a look now at the Gemara. Bishlama shema shachach l'chayi. So let's go back to this thing. They make the Kohen Gadol recite the verses, right? Recite the psukim. So I can understand, says the Gemara, that we're worried that maybe he forgot. That I can understand. But where could we ever have a situation where they said, maybe you never learned it in the first place? How could you have a Kohen Gadol who never learned the protocol of Yom Kippur? After all, the Kohen Gadol has to be a learned Talmud Chacham, because Ve'atanya, as the Brisa says, Ve'hakohen hagadol me'echav, the Kohen who shall be superior to his brethren. What does that teach me? Sheyehi gadol me'echav b'koach b'noi b'chachma uva'osher. That he has to be superior to his fellow Kohanim in his beauty, his physical beauty, his wisdom, his knowledge and his wealth. So you see that these 4 features of the Kohen Gadol are required. He has to have all of these things proficiently. So how can you tell me that he doesn't have enough chachma to know the protocol? It's one thing if he forgets, but to say that he never learned it, that doesn't jive with this brisa. The brisa continues and it says that acherim omrim minayin she'im ein lo she'echav hakohanim megadlim oso. Others say that how do you know that if the Kohen Gadol is not endowed with wealth, that his fellow Kohanim have to make him whole and they have to enrich him? Where do you see this? Tamulomar v'hakohen hagadol me'echav gadleu mishalachav. So the word me'echav could either mean more than his brethren, but it could also mean from his brethren, which means that the Kohen Gadol shall become wealthy from his brethren. That if the Kohen Gadol has all the milas, but he just doesn't have a good bank account, so his fellow Kohanim have to enrich him. But the bottom line is, you see from this price that the Kohen Gadol has to be a Talmud Chacham. So how could he possibly have never learned it? Amar Rav Yosef lo kasha kan b'mikdash rishon kan b'mikdash sheni. The answer is that we're talking about the first temple versus the second temple. In the first temple, this was an imperative. And it sounds like, even though this is a drasha from the pasuk, either it's only an asmachta, or perhaps you could argue that even if it's a biblical requirement, it's only lechatchila, but it's not ma'akev, it's not a b'di'evid. And therefore, in the second temple, they allowed Kohanim Gedolim who did not have Chachma. The Amar Rebbe Asi Tarkava Didinri Aila La Marta Bas Baitus Lianei Malka Al Deukme Li Yoshua Ben Gambla Bekohani Ravravi. As Rabbi Asi says that there was a whole chest of coins that Marta Bas Baitus gave to Yanai the king in order to make her husband Yoshua Ben Gamla the Kohen Gadol. Tosfos makes an interesting point. Tosfos says that this was not the same Yanai Melech, the famous Yanai Melech towards the end of the Second Temple, who made himself a Kohen Gadol, because why would he allow Yoshua ben Gamla to become the Kohen Gadol if he was serving as the Kohen Gadol?
Just out of curiosity, is this is a statement or is it a historical analysis of the reality of it? That the BAYT Fri Jun, the Kohanim, fulfilled these obligations. BAYT Sheni, because of all the bribery and everything that went on, they didn't.
Right, that's correct. But the question is, how could it have been tolerated?
Because they had no choice.
Yeah. I don't know if it's because they had no choice. The avoda would still have to be kosher, b'di'evid. Otherwise it couldn't be tolerated. Right? So there had to be some kind of halachic justification to allow it, even though it wasn't optimal. That's my whole point. Erev Yom Kippurim Shacharis v'chulei. In other words, what I'm saying is it wasn't completely the Wild West. There was still some level of frumkeit. Yeah, people felt that they were still observing halacha and were rationalizing their halachic observance within a milieu of corruption. Okay?
But they weren't all Kohanim, were they? The people that were appointed during that time, they weren't even Kohanim.
No, they were Kohanim Gedolim. Yeah. The only one that we know of that wasn't, did not have proper yichus was Yanai Malka. Everyone else was a meyuchas, as far as we know. Chashmonoim, sure.
Oh, that's for sure.
Erev Yom Kippurim Shacharis v'chulei. Okay, now Erev Yom Kippur, we pass before him all different kinds of animals to remind him. So Tana Afasi Irim. There's a brisa that says not only bulls, rams, and sheep, but also goats. Why doesn't our Mishnah, Zvetana Didan my time below Tani Sirim, why doesn't our Mishnah list goats? Kaven da al chet ka'asi chol shadaite. The answer is that our Mishnah holds we did not pass goats before him, because if we would, he would have a chalisha sadas. He would become quite distraught. Why would he become distraught? Because the whole purpose of the Sa'ir is to atone for the sins of the people. And he would say, "Oi, how are we going to be mechaper for all the sins of the Yidden?" And he's going to be so upset. He's going to say, like, how is such a thing going to be possible? He's going to be tzitering. He's going to be very, very worried and concerned. But all of the other karbanos are not to atone for their sins, and therefore he's not going to become distraught. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi parnami al chetu da'asi." So frak the Gemara, but the bull on Yom Kippur is an atoning bull, because the Kohen Gadol confesses for his sins and the sins of his clan. So that's also an atoning bull. So par kevin da'alav alecha v'kohanim hu da'asi be'echav ha'kohanim i'ika inish de'ispe milsa made the yadalei u'mahadrlei b'teshuva. Answers the Gemara, the difference between the par and the sa'ir, the bull and the goat, is that the bull comes to atone for his fellow kohanim. And a Kohen Gadol can say to himself, look, I know that there are some of my brethren who have done averas, but he can identify them. And if he knows that someone has done an avera, he can speak to the guy and get him to do tshuva. However, kulhu Yisrael lo yada. But how's he supposed to be able to know all of the Jews who have committed averos? So that's why he's going to be so distraught. With his kohanim, it's a finite number of kohanim. He can identify them and he can help them do tshuva. So he's not going to have a chalisha sadas that this ain't going to work, because he can say, okay, I got to work on my fellow kohanim. But when it comes to Gans Klal Yisrael, thousands upon thousands of people, how am I ever going to be able to get them to do tshuva and to have this goat atone for them? And that's why he's going to be distraught.
Also, there's a more miraculous aspect by the goat, since it turns white in the spring. I mean, that's a pretty high level.
That's an interesting point. He may be worried that maybe it's not the red, the string's not going to turn white. Okay. The Gemara doesn't mention that, but that's an interesting ha'ara. Amar Ravina, Haino Darmi Inshi, Ibar Achtech Daila Havei, so he says that's why people say that if your nephew is a tax collector, don't make yourself conspicuous in the marketplace. Don't pass before him in the marketplace. Now what that means is like this, is that it's one thing if the CRA guy or the IRS guy is a stranger. Then you can hide your assets from him quite easily. He doesn't know you. He's never been to your house before. But if your nephew becomes the head CRA guy, he's been in your house. He's seen all your artwork and your fancy tchotchkes and your furniture. You can't then declare on your taxes that you're a poor man, because he knows. And therefore, you're going to be in trouble. So that's the whole idea behind the Kohen Gadol will know his fellow Kohanim. He'll know who's good and who's not good, who's been naughty and who's been nice, right? But because they're his fellow Kohanim, right? So that's the context that the Gemara brings this phrase in. Kol shivas hayamim lo hayumonim v'chulei, for the full 7 days they let the Kohen Gadol eat whatever he wanted. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekusa Omer machilan osos latos ubeitzim kedei lamasm so. But on Erev Yom Kippur, what did we say? We don't give him a lot to eat. So this Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekusa says that on Erev Yom Kippur you should give him to eat eggs and fine flour, and this acts as a laxative, and it'll empty his bowels before Yom Kippur, and that's a good thing to do because you don't want him to have to go to the bathroom on Yom Kippur when he's doing the avoda. So Amrulo Kol Shekain Shata Meviu Lidei Chimum. So the Chachamim disagree with him, and they say no. These things not only they may act as a laxative, but they have a negative effect in that they're going to increase his sperm count, and that may cause him to have a carry. So Tanya. So the Bryson now says Sumchas Omar Mishum Reb Meir Ein Machilan Oso Lo Abi V'Amri Lo Abibi. So Sumchus gives an acronym in the name of Reb Meir. Don't give him to Kohen Gadol to eat Aleph Beis Yud, 3 kinds of food, and some say Abibi, 4 kinds of food. And V'yesh Omrim, and others say Aflo Yayin Yilavan. We agree with all of the aforementioned, but don't give him white wine either. Lo Abi, what is Abi? Lo Esrog v'lo Beitzim v'lo Yayin Yashan. Aleph is Esrog, Beis is Beitzim, eggs, and Yud is Yayin Yashan, aged wine. V'amri lo Abibi, which is 4 things. Esrog v'lo Beitzim v'lo Basar Shamin. They add fatty meat. Also is not good for withholding carry. V'lo Yayin Yashan, nor aged wine. V'yesh Omrim, and others learn Af lo Yayin Lavan. Not white wine either. Why? Because white wine also will cause a person to have a seminal emission. Tanu Rabbanan. In a related discussion, the Bryson is talking about the laws of a Zav. A Zav is a person who has a series of abnormal gonorrheal emissions, and as a result is Tameh. If he has 2 of those emissions, then he's rendered into a Zav Gadol. He has these Zav that's Tameh for 7 days. So Zav Tolan Lo B'machal, B'chol Minei Ma'achal, that the only time that a Zav can be rendered Tameh for 7 days is if his emissions were not the result of food ingestion. We ask him, what did you eat before you had your emission? If he ate specific kinds of, if he had like a really, really big meal, and these kinds of foods have an effect upon his system, and they could cause him to have an emission. So that kind of flow that he has as a result of having this big meal with certain kinds of foods does not render him tameh. And by the way, Rashi points out that that's only true by a zav, but tumas keri he still has, because tumas keri, which is a day-long tumah, you are rendered tameh regardless of whether it's done b'ratzon or I should say ba'ones, or through the natural course of events happening naturally by itself. Even if you row a keri as a result of eating certain foods, you're still rendered tameh for the day. You just are not rendered a tumas zav for 7 days if it's a result of eating certain foods. Elazar ben Pinchas Omer Mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Ein machilan oso lo chagabi v'lo gabam v'lo kol advarim hamivin lidei tuma. That now Elazar ben Pinchas says the following. He says when a Zav wants to purify himself during his 7 days of purification, you want to make sure that he doesn't have any future emissions, because then he'd have to start the 7 days all over again. So make sure that he doesn't eat certain foods, and these foods also are discussed by the Gemara as causing him to perhaps have these emissions. So what are they? Chagabi and Gabam, or any other kind of food that brings to Tumah. So these Chagabi and Gabam are acronyms. What do they stand for? Lo Chagabi, Lo Chala, Velo Gvina, Velo Beitza, Velo Yayin. Milk, cheese, eggs, and wine. And what is Gabam? Megrisin Shalpul, Ubasar Shamen Umurias. They are bean water. When you boil beans, I guess the water from or like bean soup or the bean water, you shouldn't drink that. Fatty meat and fish brine. Those things, all of these 7 things can cause a person to have an emission. And the final statement of, or anything else that could cause a person to have an emission, what is that coming to include? To include what the Brisa says. There are 5 things that cause a person to have a seminal flow. What are they? Hashom, garlic. V'hashachlayim, cress. V'chaglaglugos, which are Rashi calls fulfur or pulfur, a certain kind of herb, ve'habeitzim, and eggs, and gargir, which is Rashi calls aruga, which is a certain kind of herb that was known at that time. Now the Gemara brings a pasuk. Vayetze echad el hasada lelaket orot. The pasuk in Menachem Bay's chapter 4 talks about a miracle that Elisha had performed, that there was a man who went to gather wild herbs. He made a stew with these herbs in a pot, and people tasted it, and they said that there's something not right with this stew. There's something wrong. There's like something poisonous with it. Elisha then takes a handful of flour, puts it in the pot, and is able to miraculously make the pot edible. Right? So that was, it's just, the Nach is recording a series of miracles that Elisha performed. So this herb is called the herb of Oros. So the Gemara just points out, Tana Mishmei de Rebbe Meir ze gargir. This is the gargir herb, and I guess sometimes it can be so pungent to the point of being potentially toxic. So Amar Rebbe Yochanan, Lama Nikra Shman Oros. Why is it called Oros, this gargir herb, which means lights? So Shemeiros Esainaim. Why? Because it's good for the eyes. It's healthy. When it's eaten properly, it's actually very therapeutic for eyesight. And therefore, Amar Rav Huna, Hamotze Gargir, Im Yachol La'ochlo Ochlo, V'im Lav Mavir Al Gabe Einov. If you find a Gargir herb, you should eat it. And if you can't eat it for whatever reason, maybe it's too toxic or whatever, maybe it's too strong, place it on your eyes, and it's very good for eyesight. It must have some kind of mineral or vitamin in it, or chemical that is therapeutic for eyesight. Maybe it's got, what is it, vitamin D? Is that what's vitamin A? Vitamin A's got some vitamin A in it. Who knows?
Carrots.
Yeah.
Corner shelf.
Spinach.
Amar Rav Papa, begargira mitzrana'a. The only time that this gargir is therapeutic for eyesight is only when it's growing on the border of the field, so that it's not boxed in by other growths, in which case it has the ability to grow very strong and has that certain therapeutic, right, has the potency to be therapeutic. Now, the following Gemara is extremely problematic. I preface this with this Gemara with those words because, as you'll see why. This Gemara appears in duplicate. It appears also in Maseches Yevamos and DAF Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, and I just want to go through it. You'll see the context is talking about the concern about having keri, about having a seminal flow, and then you'll see the connection to these rabbis who wanted to make sure that they would not be roa keri, and so they took the following precautions. We'll try to explain it once we finish the Gemara. Amar of Gidol Amar Rav. So before we get to that, we'll just see the one more line. Amar of Gidol Amar Rav Achsanai lo yochal beitzim. If you're a host, if you're a guest at someone's house, you should not eat eggs. V'lo yishon betaliso shel balabayis, and you should not sleep in the bedding of the balabas. Why? Because number one, don't eat eggs because that'll increase your semen count, and that'll cause you to stain his sheets, and also don't sleep in his sheets because you may come to stain them. Now, of course, I believe that cultural and societal norms have changed since the times of the Gemara. Now that they wash the linens every time, that usually, I mean, I hope you do this, otherwise I won't stay at your house. But usually when you have a guest over, you wash the linens immediately after the guest is there. But in the times of the Gemara, it was a big geschäft to do the laundry, so therefore it's not considerate, it's not derech eretz to stain the host's bedding because they're not going to do. It's a big geschäft to have to do the laundry. So anyway, Rav Kimekla ledarshish machriz man havyu YOMA. Now here's the problematic Gemara. When Rav came to the town of Darshish, he says, "Who would like me for the day?" Rashi explains that he was offering any of the maidens of the town to be his wife for the day. And ostensibly the purpose is, like we talked about the issue of keri, he wanted to avoid having keri, so he wanted to have some release by having a temporary wife to be able to relieve his tension, and that way he would avoid any problems. And then he would just have her for the day, and then he would divorce her and go back home to his family. Rav Nachman, Kadmikla l'shachnetziv machriz man havyu YOMA. When Rav Nachman came to the town of Shachnetziv, he said the same thing. Who wants me to be my wife for the day? So the Gemara now says, "V'hatanya Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer lo yisa adam isha b'medina zu v'yelech v'yisa isha b'medina acheres. Shema yizdavgu ze yitzal ze v'nimtza ach no se'achoso. U'memela kol ha'olam kulo mamzerus." But wait a minute, we learned the halacha that you're not supposed to have one wife in one country and another wife in another country. Why? Because if your two wives don't know each other, then they may have children from the same husband, and then they'll want to make a shidduch, and a brother will not know that he's being ret a shidduch with his sister because they only know who the mothers are, they won't know who the fathers are. And about that the pasuk says the world will be filled with lewdness. So the Gemara says, you see from here that it's not proper to marry, to have one wife in one town and another wife in another town. So what right did these Amoraim have to do that? So Amri Rabbanan Kala Islahu. The Gemara says that's not a problem because the Chachamim are celebrities. And when the girl's walking around trying to find a shidduch, she'll put on her resume that my father's Rabbi so-and-so. Because that's a big yichus. So of course you'll know who the father is. The mother will say, your father, would come to Shachnatziv once every couple of months, and I was his wife in this town of Shachnatziv. I mean, isn't there like a song like this from the Beach Boys or something about,
East
at every
Coast girls are hip,
right, or like at every port city I have a different girl. I mean, it sounds crazy when you think about it, right? But anyway, so now the Gemara says, "V'ha'amar Rava tiva'ua lihinase v'nispaisa tzricha leishiv shivinikim." Well, now we have another problem. The Gemara never even touches on the problem of what about the fact that this itself is lewd. This itself is an abuse of the daughters of Israel. But we'll put that aside for a second. What about another problem? How can you come into town and say, I'm ready to get married right now? The halacha is that you have to give a girl 7 days to count shivinikim. Because even in the times of the Gemara, when Shiva Nikiyim were not required before marriage, we did require a girl to examine herself 7 days before the wedding in order to make sure that the excitement of marriage would not cause her to have some kind of abnormal menstrual flow. So that's the halacha. So how could a rabbi come off the boat and say, I'm ready to get married right now, who wants to marry me? She'd have to go through 7 days of waiting. So the Gemara answers, Rabbanan odui hava moda'u lahu mikedem, or mikdam havu mikadmi, umeshadri shilucha. The answer is that the Chachamim would give a notification and in advance, and they would send shluchim to the town 7 or 8 days in advance, and they'd say that Rav or Rav Nachman is coming to town, and whoever would like to be his wife should get ready for the next 7 days. So that's one answer, says the Gemara. V'iboyis ema. Another answer, says the Gemara, is yichudei havu miyachadi lahu lefi she'eino doma misha yesh lo pas b'salo lemisha ein lo pas b'salo. Answers the Gemara that we're not talking about physical intimacy with these women. That's not at all the discussion over here. And like Rabbeinu Chananel adds the words chas v'shalom. God forbid that would even be the suggestion that these rabbis would do this to gratify themselves physically, but rather it's true to relieve their sexual tension, but how do you relieve it? You just say, you young lady are my wife, you're designated as my wife, and without consummating anything, without having any intimacy, the very fact that I know that I have a wife in this town alleviates me of my tension, because now I have what's called pas b'salo, I have bread in my basket. I know that in a case of emergency, I'll be able to relieve myself, and that knowledge in and of itself is enough to relieve the anxiety and the tension.
So they would get married, or like they had to, that's designated that they could possibly.
Well, it's not clear from the language of the Gemara. Yechudei ba'alma, Rashi explains ve'enis kakim lahem ela shahanasu isha ein misave kemisha ein lo isha. It's mashma from Rashi that their taka was a chuppah v'kiddushin. Their taka was a chuppah, and she would be his wife, but they never had yichud. But just that he knows that this woman is my wife. Or maybe they had yichud, but there was never any physical touching, right? Now, the question, of course, is, how do you go through this Gemara? How are we supposed to make sense of this? So there are those who just learn it like the Pashut Pshat. And like Rabbeinu Chananel says, at the end, Chas v'shalom, you totally misunderstood. We knew that this was the outcome all the time. That's one way of understanding it. I was looking around a little bit, and I noticed that in the old Cincino Gemaras, there's a very interesting footnote. He writes as follows: there's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah that says that one of the Persian ancient practices was that if you were visiting a Persian dignitary and you were staying with him for a couple of days, they would give you a Persian girl to be your consort. That was the practice. It was like you got chocolates on your pillow and you got a girl waiting for you also on your pillow, right? And that was the practice. And the Gemara even relates a story about two rabbinic people who were traveling, and one took advantage of the Persian hospitality and the other one didn't. And the Gemara is critical of the one who took advantage of the Persian hospitality. The point is that it wasn't just that they provided you with this consort, but it was considered to be a tremendous insult to your host if you didn't take this girl as the gift for the evening. And so these Chachamim wanted to avoid the nisayon of having to be given a consort. And so whenever they traveled, they made sure that there was a woman that would be their wife in the town, so that they could avoid having to have, they could explain, I'm sorry, but I can't have a consort, I'm traveling with my wife. And that's the reason why they went through this whole process. So that would explain, again, contextually, it certainly explains how they wanted to relieve the tension or the nisayon of having to succumb to their baser desires, but at the same time, they did it in order to avoid having to accept the non-Jewish Persian girl as their consort. But the Gemara never entertained the possibility that they were doing this for their own gratification.
That excuse was acceptable to the Persian.
So the Persian, look, if I'm traveling with the Rebbitzin, you can't give me a consort. Come on. I mean, even Persians have standards, right?
I think the next morning, that one rabbi, he gave him new kalim, and the other one, he took the knife and they stuck it in the ground to kasher it.
Yeah.
And he said, well, why did he get new and I have questionable kashers? He says, well, he didn't accept my gift last night and you did,
That's
so
right,
we figured you're pretty lax anyways.
Right.
That's what we're going to do for you.
Yeah.
The knife that was in the ground.
That's right. Good. Okay. So, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Misaruhu zikne, based in l'zikne kahuna, ve'eluhu la'aliyas beis avtinas. The next step was, I guess, towards Erev Yom Kippur, the elders of the Beis Din passed him on to the elder Kohanim. And the elder Kohanim were there to remind him of everything that he had to do. They took him up to the special chamber of Beis Avtinas where they manufactured the Ketores. And Vihishbi'uhu. They made him take an oath. Now, what oath did they make him take? As we'll see, there was a big debate between the Tzedukim and the rabbinic community as to the proper protocol of offering the incense in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The Masorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh was that you had to pour the incense on the coals in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But the Tzedukim said, no, pour it on the coals before you get in so that you walk in with the smoke coming up. So this was a big debate, and so in order to be able to ensure that the Kohen Gadol was not at Tzduki, they made him swear that he would do it according to the instructions of the Beis Din and of the Kohanim who were faithful to Torah Sheba'al Peh. V'niftaru v'holchu lahem, and then they left. V'amru lo, but they said to him before leaving, they said, Ishi Kohen Gadol anu shluchei Beis Din, Sir Kohen Gadol, we are proxies of the Beis Din, va'ata shlucheinu u'shliach Beis Din, and you are our shliach, we the Kohanim, and you're also the shliach of the Beis Din and all of Klal Yisrael. Mashbi'in anu alecha b'mi sheshachan shemo b'bayis hazeh shelo tishaneh davar mikol ma she'amarnu lecha, that we hereby place an oath upon you in the name of He, the Lord, who places His divine presence in this house, that you not change anything, one iota from all the instructions that we give you. Hu poreshu boche vehein poreshenu bochen. So he then turns aside and cries. They turn aside and cry, and this is part of our liturgy of the Yom Kippur Avoda. You remember why they're both crying. The Gemara will speak this out, but they're crying because they accuse him of being a tzeduki, and no one likes to be accused of being a tzeduki. They cry because they're choshed b'ksherim. They suspect a kosher person of being inappropriate. So of course it's embarrassing and humiliating and upsetting for both of them, so they both cry. Now, im haya chacham doresh v'im lav tamidei chachamim dorshim lefanav. And next, if the Kohen Gadol himself is a Talmud Chacham, he expounds on, he gives drashas and everyone's listening to him. And if not, then other Chachamim expound for him. V'im ragil likros korei v'im lav koren lefanav. And if he is well versed in Scripture, he recites Scripture, and if not, Scripture is recited before him. Again, to review all of the halachos and to go over many of the details. Uvama koren lefanav. Now, we also want to make sure that he stays awake, that he's not going to fall asleep, so that he's not roa keri. So we have to recite psukim not just of the story of Yom Kippur, but also things that will keep him engaged and awake. So what do we recite? The Eov, Uve Ezra, Uve Divrei Hayomim. We read Sefer Eov, Sefer Ezra, Divrei Hayomim, the historical components of the Tanakh stories. I never thought that Eov was so exciting, but apparently, according to the Mishnah, to me, Eov gets a little dry after the first couple of prakim. But I guess I don't have an appreciation because of my low madrega. But for a person who could really understand the whole issue of theodicy and the philosophical implications of Eov, it was fascinating. And so they would recite Eov and Sefer Ezra, building of the second Beis HaMikdash, Divrei Hayomim. That would keep him awake. Zechariah ben Kevutal Omer Pa'amim Harbei Karisi Lefanav B'Daniel. Zechariah ben Kevutal apparently lived into the times of the Second Temple, and he says he must have been a Kohen who would read for the Kohen Gadol at the time, and he says many years I read for the Kohen Gadol from the book of Daniel, which is also a very engaging book of Nach, and that also would keep the Kohen Gadol awake. And this is where we'll hold it for today.